Good afternoon, everyone. So for today's lesson, we are going to discuss how to do critical appraisal of topics on articles evaluating tests for diagnostics. So I'm Dr. Ana Angelica Macalalad Josue, and our objectives for today. At the end of this session, the student should be able to formulate a PICO question from a clinical scenario tackling a diagnostic test. Next, we're going to learn how to appraise directness, validity, and the results of an article on diagnostics. And lastly, we are going to apply and individualize the results of the study to our patient or patients. So let's start first with a clinical scenario. So pretend that while working as a company physician for a BPO company, you were asked by your HR department if you can screen for COVID-19 among returning employees using rapid antigen test kits, or what we call RAT kits. You were able to attend a webinar stating the poor diagnostic accuracy of RAT kits. Now our question is, will you recommend the use of RAT kits among your employees? And how will you respond to your HR department? So tests may be performed for various reasons. One, it's either planning for an intervention. Let's say you have a patient with prostate mass and you want to plan surgery. So you want to do a CT scan so you can plan how you will be doing your prostatectomy. Next, you want to monitor response to therapy. An example is if you have a patient with diabetes, you started the patient on anti-diabetes medications and you want to know if the medications and the diet and the lifestyle is working, you request for an HbA1c. Next is to estimate the risk of future events. So an example of this would be testing for a BRCA gene, no, to determine your risk for breast cancer in the future. So that's another diagnostic test. And then lastly, to determine prognosis in patients with known disease. So an example would be, for example, in patients with differentiated thyroid cancer, we usually monitor thyroglobulin so that we will know the risk of patient having recurrence of their thyroid cancer. So those are the various reasons where tests may be requested by the physician. So now I'd like to review with you again the 3 skills of EBM before we proceed to evaluate articles for therapy in patients with articles for diagnostic tests. First, just like in our EBM cycle, first we do acquire. And when we acquire, we ask a focused clinical question. We conduct a search. We retrieve the information so we can have the journal article. Once we have the journal article, we now proceed to appraise the article. Appraise for directness, appraise for validity, and appraise the results. And lastly, be able to apply the article, the information or the results that we got from the article to our patient. Is it applicable, and how do we individualize the results to our individual patient in our clinical scenario? So going back to your clinical scenario, if this were your clinical scenario, what now is your clinical question? So we go to, since this is not it could be PICO or PECO, whatever. So our P would be asymptomatic people. No? These are the returning employees that have no symptoms at all. And then our exposure or our intervention will be a rapid antibody test. Our comparator would be the reference standard as of the moment for the diagnosis of COVID-19, which is your RT-PCR. And lastly, our outcome will be the diagnosis of COVID-19. So there are several ways by which we can phrase diagnostic questions. So these are the usual syntax for asking a clinical question on diagnosis. So one syntax would be, what is the accuracy of, let's say, rapid antigen test kits compared to RT-PCR in the diagnosis of COVID-19? Another way of saying it is, what is the probability of COVID-19 among patients with rapid antigen test kits compared to those with a positive rapid antigen, positive for IgG, IgM, with the use of rapid antigen test kits compared to those without, or those with negative IgG, IgM rapid antigen test finding. And lastly, another way of phrasing your diagnostic question on this clinical scenario is, what is the probability of COVID-19 or the target condition among patients with a positive IgG, IgM rapid antigen test given a pretest probability of the target condition? So these are ways on how we should be phrasing diagnostic questions. So after you've already broken down your clinical question into a PICO format, we can now do the search strategy. So I did the search strategy, and these were the keywords that I used. So I used the synonyms rapid antibody test, lateral flow immunoassay, IgG, IgM rapid test kit, antibody rapid testing, and then I merged it with the syntax for COVID-19. This is actually already predetermined by your PubMed. So, and then I combined them together. So we were able to come up with 121 articles. And among these articles, this is the article that I chose. This article was published from the Journal of Clinical Virology entitled Evaluation of 2 Automated and 3 Rapid Lateral Flow Immunoassays for the Detection of Anti-SARS-CoV-2 Antibodies. So your anti-SARS-CoV-2 is your COVID-19. So briefly, we're just going to look at the abstract for this article because you don't have the full article. You can retrieve it, of course, on your own volition, but just so for this afternoon's discussion, so I'd just like to go through its abstract. No? So several SARS-CoV-2 immunoassays have been developed recently, and the purpose of the study was to assess the performance of 5 immunoassays for the detection of SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. So they evaluated 2 quantitative automated immunoassays and 3 lateral flow rapid tests. So the rapid antibody test kits that are available in the market in the Philippines right now are what you call lateral flow rapid tests. No, you put the blood of the patient in the kit, then you put a reagent, and you will allow the mixture of the reagent and the blood to flow in a lateral fashion throughout the test kits. No? So this is actually a retrospective study that included 200 residual sera from patients and healthy volunteers. So the cases, those who we know already that's positive for COVID-19 were 128, and this is confirmed by RT-PCR and your CT scan. So they also broke down the, then they also got controls. No? Controls are those who are not negative, who don't have COVID-19, so this were 72, were obtained from anonymous stored residual serum samples. Okay. So again, among our clinical question in our BPO case scenario, we're testing asymptomatic people, asymptomatic employees, and we want to know if rapid antibody test kits is accurate. No? compared with your RT-PCR test in diagnosing COVID-19. So in the article in our journal, we again compare our clinical question with the research question, and the research question will correspond to your journal article. So you have symptomatic people, and they looked at rapid antibody test kits. And sorry, this is wrong. The comparator is RT-PCR test, and the outcome is COVID-19 antibodies. No? So if you look at the comparison, it's not directly comparable with one another because we're testing asymptomatic people, but the article actually tested symptomatic people. And then the outcome for our clinical question is a diagnosis of COVID-19, while in our journal article, they were actually looking for COVID-19 antibodies, which is not exactly the same as having a diagnosis of COVID-19. But this is the best article that we could find. So since this is the best article we could find in the literature, we will have to make some adjustments when we make our conclusions at the end of our evaluation for this journal article. So again, this is wrong. It should be RT-PCR because RT-PCR is the reference standard that they use in the journal article. So is it direct enough? Not exactly. So, but it doesn't mean we have to throw away the article right away. It just means that we have to make some adjustments in our interpretation later on, because most likely the journal article, since they tested symptomatic people, would most likely overestimate the accuracy of rapid antibody test kits when used in asymptomatic people. So now we proceed with appraising the validity of the results. So in our first question, was the reference standard an acceptable one? And the second question, was the reference standard interpreted independently for the test in question? So how do we answer this question? So we go first to the first question. Was the reference standard an acceptable one? What is a reference standard? So a reference standard is usually the gold standard. The gold standard is the test that can unequivocally establish the presence or absence of the disease in question. And the classic gold standard would be a histopath or a biopsy result. So for example, if you want to diagnose breast cancer, the gold standard is a tissue biopsy or the histopathology of your tissue from your breast mass. But it doesn't mean it's not always the gold standard that can be used as a reference standard. We can also use an acceptable standard. An acceptable standard defines disease in a way that is acceptable to medical practitioners. So for example, in the diagnosis of PPD, the gold standard really is AFB culture. However, the problem with AFB culture is it takes a long time. You need 4 weeks, and you need special culture media in order to be able to isolate the AFB, the acid-fast bacilli. But we have your DSSM or your direct sputum smear microscopy. So if you're able to observe your acid-fast bacilli there, then you can diagnose already with PPD. That's an acceptable standard that's been accepted by most physicians. And lastly, you also have disease definition. No? These are definitions of conditions that have been officially adopted by specialty organizations such as your SLIC criteria for SLE. You also have the diagnosis for diabetes, let's say FBS of more than 126 milligrams per deciliter on 2 occasions, HbA1c of more than 6.5 from a acceptable reference standard laboratory, or random blood sugar more than 200 with symptoms of with classic symptoms of hyperglycemia. So those are acceptable. Those disease definition can also be considered reference standard from which you can compare your diagnostic test in question. Okay, so these are the 4 questions that we need to answer and when we want to appraise the validity of the result. So if you can see with the questions, there are, let's say here, in the second question was the definition of the index test and the reference standard independent, was the performance of the index test and the reference standard independent, and lastly was the interpretation of the index test and the reference standard independent. So the independence between the treatment of your reference standard and the index test or the test that you are trying to evaluate is very important. So how do we say that there's independent interpretation? Independent interpretation assures us of that one, the interpretation of your index test is not influenced by the interpretation of your reference standard, no? However, it can be difficult in certain situations, no? So these are some of the reasons where independence of interpretation between the two tests becomes much more difficult. So for one, in most situations, there is no perceived need to maintain independence. So for example, when you're trying to diagnose pneumonia, usually when you request for a chest x-ray, you also indicate there what you're looking for. Let's say pneumonia, rule out congestion. So the radiologist will have an idea what you're trying to look for. Next, the result of a test often becomes the indication for performing the reference standard. So it allows one test to influence performance and interpretation of the other. So for example, in a patient with, let's say, COVID, no? Let's say you do rapid antibody testing and then one of them is positive, IgG or IgM, it prompts the clinician to do an RT-PCR test. Or for example, you have a patient who had screening mammography and then they find some microcalcifications in the screening mammography, and this prompts the clinician to request a tissue biopsy. Yeah? So we will not be performing the tissue biopsy if it were not for the presence of the microcalcifications in the mammogram. And lastly, the result of the test itself is part of the reference standard. So for example, in the definition of your acute myocardial infarction, diba, you have multiple criteria. You have ECG-based, symptom-based, and enzyme-based. No? So one of this is troponin. No? So if troponin is positive, then you have the diagnosis of AMI. And that sort of compounds the interpretation of the test itself as part of, because it's also part of the reference standard. So that's where, those are some of the instances where it will be difficult. But if you know how to design a good diagnostic evaluation study, you should be able to try to overcome these situations in order for the interpretation of the two tests to become independent. So how do we answer the first question for validity? Was the reference standard an acceptable one? So look for how the authors define presence or absence of disease in the study population. Is it acceptable in your practice? So you have to identify how a certain disease is diagnosed in your community. Then, and if it's actually acceptable. Okay. Was the definition of the index test and the reference standard independent? So how do we answer this? Look at the criteria used to interpret the index test and the reference standard. Make sure that these criteria do not overlap. So how do we answer this in our journal article? So was the reference standard an acceptable one? Yes. Although, because in the journal article, our reference standard is RT-PCR and CT scan. Although RT-PCR as a test and as a test diagnosing COVID-19 is not a perfect test, but it has largely been accepted by the medical community as the gold standard, but it's not 100% accurate. So in fact, a systematic review of the accuracy of COVID-19 RT-PCR tests reported false negative rates between 2 and 29%, but RT-PCR is still the widely accepted reference standard when diagnosing COVID-19. So the answer is yes. Next question was the definition of the index test. So here we're focusing on definition. Of the index test and the reference standard independent, yes, there's no overlap because the interpretation, the definition of a positive IgG, IgM is not affected by the, does not overlap with the interpretation of the RT-PCR, whether it's positive or negative. Next, the third question was the performance of the index test and the reference standard independent. So what do we look for in the article when we're trying to answer this question? So check whether measures were taken to ensure that the result of the index test was not an indication for doing the reference standard. So, so it should be that the performance of doing the reference standard is having a positive index test. Having a positive index test is not the trigger to do the reference standard. So in this case, in our journal article, let's see, we'll answer it in the next slide. So for all the patients, both rapid antibody tests were done. Both RAT and both RT-PCR was done on all patients, and the performance of RAT was not dependent on whether the patient had a positive RT-PCR or not, and vice versa. The positivity or the negativity of the RAT test did also not trigger RT-PCR because all the patients both had RAT and RT-PCR. So for the last question for appraising validity was the interpretation of the index test and the reference standard independent. So look for terms such as independent or blind interpretation of the result. So ideally, the one, let's say in this article, the one doing the RAT test should have no knowledge at all if this sample, this patient, the patient who from where the sample came from was COVID-19 positive or not, and vice versa. Those interpreting the RT-PCR should also have no knowledge what the RAT result is. So, however, if you read the whole article, they did not mention anything, but likely it's not because of the retrospective nature of the study. So we have no idea whether the performance of the RT, those performing the RT-PCR had knowledge of the rapid test or the rapid test. Those who doing the rapid tests had knowledge of what the RT-PCR results are. So we don't know. So do you think we should proceed with reading the rest of the article? I think so. I think the journal article is worth, the results of the journal article is worth reading because so far almost all of the validity questions were okay. So what were the likelihood ratios of the various results? So when you're appraising an article for a diagnostic test, we usually look at likelihood ratios. Remember, for articles of therapy, we look at absolute risk reduction, relative risk reduction, relative risk, and number needed to treat. So when we're appraising results for a diagnostic test, we look at likelihood ratios, no? So remember, there are several tests can either be positive or negative, or there are also from which we can construct a 2x2 table. But there are also some tests that includes intermediate results, and if there's an intermediate result, we do a 2x(n) table. But for 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 this afternoon, we'll just focus on a 2x2 table. So I'll just like to introduce to you some terms that we will be using throughout the lecture. So we have sensitivity. Sensitivity is a measure or the ability to detect people who actually have the disease. On the other hand, we have your specificity or the ability of the test to detect people who do not have the disease. No? So the ability to detect people who are negative, who don't have the disease, who are healthy. Okay, next, we have your positive predictive value. So the positive predictive value is the likelihood that a person with a positive test result truly has the disease. So it's able to predict whether having a positive test will really translate to having true disease. And then lastly, negative predictive value is the likelihood that a person with a negative test result truly does not have the disease. So I just have a question for you guys. So which tests is required in situations where consequences of a false negative would be very bad? So for example, screening donor blood for HIV. So for example, if you miss HIV when you're screening blood, no, that would be very devastating for the person receiving that blood because they would be infected inadvertently with HIV. What kind of test? Is it a test that has a very high sensitivity, so it's able to pick up a lot of positives, or a very high specificity? No? It has a high ability to detect those who have truly no HIV. Or is it low sensitivity, low specificity? What do you think? Okay. So the correct answer here is a test that has a very, very high sensitivity because we want to be able to pick up those with true disease, no? Those who, the blood that have HIV. Because if we miss a positive HIV, if a test has low sensitivity or just a high specificity, then that's very devastating for the recipient of the blood. So most tests actually set a test cutoff. Usually it's really a spectrum, no? So for example, when you're doing a pregnancy test, no, you're evaluating actually the HCG levels of the blood, no? It's actually a continuum or a range of HCG levels, but those who design diagnostic tests set the test cutoff whether it's positive or negative, no? So there will be people who are healthy, who are truly negative, and there are those who have disease that are true positive. But in the test cutoff, no, if you set the test, sometimes there will be an overlap. Those with equivocal results. So you can have here, this portion will be those who test negative because they are below the test cutoff, and test negative but who actually have the disease. And those are what you call your false negatives. And you also have false positives. So false positive will be those who are don't really have the disease, here, they're actually just healthy, but they went beyond the test cutoff. So that's what we call false positive. No? So be very careful when interpreting tests because your patient might fall in either of the two. Okay? So when you compare the results of a test with a reference standard, so an index test with a reference standard, when the test has only two results, either positive or negative, we construct a 2x2 table. So if a disease is present and the test turns out positive, then we say that this is a true positive. If the patient doesn't have the disease, it's healthy, but tests positive for using the index test, then we can say that this is a false positive result. If the patient truly has the disease, but tests negative using the index test, then this is what we call false negative. And if the patient has a disease that is absent, healthy, but test negative, then we can say this is a true negative. Sorry, this is true negative. Sorry. Yeah. So we can assign in order to evaluate the test result and be able to compute the different indices for accuracy that we will take a look at this afternoon. We can assign letters like that, A, B, C, D, so it will be easier for us to understand. So if we want to compute for sensitivity, so again, the sensitivity is the proportion of persons with the disease, here with the disease, who correctly have a positive test. So those who test the true positive divided by those who really have the disease. So to help you remember, be sensitive to those who have disease. So to help you remember sensitivity, a high sensitivity is good in screening patients, for screening tests. Next, we go to specificity. So specificity is a proportion of persons with no disease, those who are truly negative, who actually correctly. So these are the proportion of patients with no disease who correctly have a negative test or your true negative. So your true negative, D over B plus D. So negative people get specific to help you remember. So specificity is actually very helpful when you're trying to confirm a test for confirmatory tests. So screening for sensitivity, specificity for confirmatory tests. Positive predictive value, proportion of persons with a positive test here, A plus B, who correctly turn out to have the disease. So A over A plus B. For negative predictive value, proportion of patients with a negative test, so that's your C plus D, who correctly turn out to have no disease. So you have D. So D over C plus D. So that's your negative predictive value. These are the traditional measures of diagnostic accuracy. However, throughout the years, this has always been how in the past when I was in med school, this is what really my teachers emphasize on: sensitivity, specificity, negative, positive, predictive value. However, right now there's been a paradigm shift on how we think about interpreting these measures of diagnostic accuracy because they've identified some problems with how to interpret this. Your positive predictive value and negative predictive value are not stable because it changes with the prevalence of the disease. So if you have a high prevalence of the disease, then you usually have a high positive predictive value and vice versa. And sensitivity and specificity, it's stable, it's not affected by the prevalence of disease, but sometimes it's not really clinically useful. So what if it's sensitive? So what if it's specific? So how will that help my patient? So later on, and this can only be done in a 2x2 table, and it doesn't really help us. It doesn't tell the physician how it can change the pre-test to post-test probability. Before doing the test, what's the pre-test probability of having the disease? And once you do the test, how does it change your probability of having the disease or your post-test probability. So they've come up with another measure of diagnostic accuracy called likelihood ratios. And likelihood ratios are the most useful ones that you can actually apply to your patients in the clinic. So likelihood ratios can be used even if you have an intermediate test result or a 2/n table. No? So if you have an intermediate test, so what are examples of intermediate tests? Let's say your thyroid FNAB, sometimes you have category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So depends on the likelihood of the cells being positive or negative for differentiated thyroid cancer, no? Or breast CA, sometimes there's equivocal if the pathologist is not sure whether it's really malignant or not. So you can have an intermediate test depending on the features of your test, no? So you can also assign letters, just like in our 2x2 table. So what are likelihood ratios? It is a measure of how much the likelihood of the disease changes given a test result. So as I mentioned earlier, if this is my probability of having the disease based on my signs and symptoms and my demographic profile, if a test is done on me, what is the likelihood that it will change my chance or my probability of truly having being able to detect disease, no? So the likelihood ratio measures how much the likelihood of disease changes given a test result. So how we compute this? The odds of the disease given a test result, so that's the post-test odds, divided by the overall odds of disease, that's your pre-test odds. No? So what's the difference between odds? Now we are introduced with another term, which is odds. Remember earlier, I kept talking about probability. So there's actually a difference between the two. Probability is computed as, think of it as a pie that is sliced into several pieces. So probability is the piece of a pie divided by the entire pie. But odds is the piece of the pie divided by the rest of the pie, not including the slice itself. So please try to imagine that in your head. So if we are going to compute it, no, the pretest odds would be the odds of the disease, no, being present, A plus C plus E, divided by the rest of the pie. No? The rest of the pie will be B plus B plus F. So you do a ratio of them, A plus C plus E divided by the rest of the pie, B plus B plus F. This is your pretest odds. No? So now we're going to compute, what does it mean? The likelihood ratio for a positive test. Does it mean for a likelihood ratio if the test is positive, the intermediate test is positive or the test is negative? So likelihood ratio is an expression of the change in the odds of the disease. So remember, likelihood ratio is the ratio of your post-test odds, no, and your pre-test odds. So if your likelihood ratio is high, let's say your post-test odds is 10, divided your pre-test odds is 1, it means that after doing the test, there has been a 10-fold increase in the odds of the disease. No, if you translate this into words, you are 10 times more likely to have the disease if you turn out to be positive in the test. No? So for example, if you have a positive AFB smear or DSSM, no? Let's say the likelihood ratio of DSSM is 10. So you can say you are 10 times more likely to have PTB if you turn out to be positive in your EFB smear. If the likelihood ratio is very low, let's say the post-test odds is 1 and the pre-test odds is 10 or 0.1, there is 10-fold drop in the odds of the disease. If the post-test odds is the same as the pre-test odds, no, 1/1, it means that doing the test result did not change the odds of the disease, because from 1, the pre-test odds, it became 1, the post-test odds. So whether you do the test or not, it doesn't change your odds of actually have the disease. So if you have a likelihood ratio of more than 1, you increase the likelihood of the disease. The higher the likelihood ratio above 1, the better it is at ruling. What is it, ruling in or ruling out a condition? So the answer to this is actually, the higher the likelihood ratio above 1, no, it increases the likelihood of you having really the disease, the better it is at ruling in a condition. If the likelihood ratio is small, no less than 1, it decreases the likelihood of the disease. The lower the likelihood ratio, below 1, the better it is at ruling out a condition. So if a test has a very low likelihood ratio, it's useful in ruling out a condition. So it doesn't mean that the likelihood ratio is very small, that it's useless. No, it's not true. It's actually very useful in ruling out a condition. So the likelihood of the disease is very, very low. You can actually just rule it out. How small is a large likelihood ratio and how small is a small one? So based on the second edition of your painless EBM, no, if a likelihood ratio is less than 3, it's nearer to 1, it's only weakly positive, no, meaning it only changes the likelihood of the disease weakly. If it's between 3 to 10, it's moderately positive, so it moderately increases the likelihood of you having having the disease. If it's more than 10, it's strongly positive, meaning it strongly increases the likelihood of you having the disease. If the likelihood ratio is less than 1 or it's small, if it's less than, sorry, this is less than 0.3, it's close to 1, it's only weakly negative, so it only weakly decreases likelihood of you not having the disease. If it's 0.3 to 0.1, it is moderately negative. And lastly, if the likelihood ratio is very, very, very small, very far away from 1, less than 0.1 is strongly negative, meaning it strongly decreases the likelihood of you having the disease. No? So it's very useful in ruling out a condition. So going back to our article, how do we apply this concepts that I've taught to you in the last few slides? So take a look at your table 2. No, they tabulated the number of patients who are were tested between day 0 to day 7 from the time of onset of symptoms. So, and then they computed the sensitivity. No? So again, so this patient had COVID-19 symptoms, and they detected, they did the rapid antibody test between 0 to 7 days from the time of onset of symptoms. So let's take a look at QuickZen. QuickZen, I think, is available locally. So this is the test that I take. So this is the sensitivity of QuickZen, 34.48%. So if we break it down into a 2x2 table, we know that the disease is present. So 10 over 29, that's your sensitivity. So we can compute the test that it's negative, that's 21, correct? No, this is wrong. Sorry. 29 minus 10. So this is actually 19. Let's recompute. This is actually 19. Okay, and then the total number of samples, remember, is 128. And the Negative control, remember in the abstract, is 72. So if we are going to compute, we can now fill in the blanks on all the remaining squares. So 72 plus 19. So, sorry. 128 minus 29. It's 99. It's wrong. 99 minus 72 is 27. Is this correct? 19 plus 72, 91. 10 plus 27 is 37. I think this is about correct. 37 plus 91. Okay, correct. 128. So going back, we corrected the numbers already. No? So 128 is the total sample, 72 is the negative control. Negative control, those who really did not have the disease, remember they got serum, anonymous serum from those who had no COVID-19, who were negative for the rapid antibody test and negative also for RT-PCR. So we fill in the numbers, okay? So let's correct this. Twenty-seven, 37. I don't know why my computation engine was wrong. 91. 91. So sensitivity 10 over 29, specificity is 72 over 99. Okay, and positive predictive value. So if it's a predictive value, you go across horizontal. So this is your 10 over 37. In your negative predictive value, you look across horizontal in your test negative. So that's your 19 over 90. Oopsie. 90. This is your sensitivity, this is your specificity, this is your positive predictive value, and this is your negative predictive value. How about your likelihood ratio? So likelihood ratio is the odds of the disease here, the post-test odds. So that's your A over B over B over overall odds of the disease. Your 100, your 29 over 95. So that's 10 over 23. So the piece of the pie versus the rest of the pie. And then 29 over 95, the piece of the pie or the overall over the rest of the pie in terms of overall. So if you compute that, so your positive likelihood ratio is 1.43. Okay. Sorry, I was not able to correct the numbers, but let's say these are the correct numbers. Just say, just so I can show you. Or maybe we should change. Let's change. so that we will have the right computation. 10, 27, 19, 37, so likelihood ratio 8 over B, this is 10 over 27. So this is the A over the rest of the pie, those who test, the rest of the patients who test positive, no, 27, and 29 is the overall who test positive over 99. The rest of the people in the pie. So 10 divided by 27, that's your 137. 29 divided by 99 is 29. 0.37 times 0.29 is 1.27. Okay, here we correct this again. 27, 37, 19, 21. So for negative, you have, so since this negative, you look at the disease absent. So C over B this is actually C over B. So 72 19 over 72, correct. Alright. 19 divided by 72. And 26. So this should be 99 divided by 95 and 30. So 0.26 divided by 0.3 is 0.86. Doesn't change really much. Okay. How do we interpret this? So in terms of positive likelihood ratio, remember our positive likelihood ratio is 1.27 and 0.86. So in terms of positive likelihood ratio, it is only weekly positive. No, it only weekly changes the likelihood of you having the disease if you are positive for IgG or IgM in the rapid antibody test kit. If the rapid antibody test kit is negative, remember what's our value again? 0.86. So it falls about here. No, is weekly negative. So if you are negative for the IgG IgM, it only weekly decreases of you having the likelihood of the disease. Okay. So as a test, the rapid antibody test only weekly changes your likelihood of the disease, whether it's positive or negative. And this is for a patient who is actually symptomatic pa. Okay? So last part will be assessing applicability. So what are the things that you consider? Just like in the others, you look for if there are any biologic issues in terms of sex, comorbidities, race, age, pathology. So far, from what I've read in the literature, the, the diagnosis of COVID-19 is not really affected by sex or the presence of comorbidities, race, age, or pathology. Socioeconomic issues affecting applicability. It will be a financial burden if it will be shouldered by the employee because the test kit ranges from 1,000 to 1,800 pesos and it only weekly tells you, it's not very good at telling you whether you have COVID-19 or not, or whether you have COVID-19 antibodies or not. Remember, it doesn't detect that it's not useful for diagnosing COVID-19. It just tells you whether you have COVID-19 antibodies or not. You still have to do the RT-PCR. And if the patient or the employee turns out to have a positive IgG, IgM, the rapid antibody test kits, you still have to do the RT-PCR in order to diagnose COVID-19 because most of the time it could be either a false negative or a false positive as we have shown earlier. So how will the test result affect the probability of the disease in your patient? So this is the time that we individualize the result of the patient. Is this test useful for your patient? So this is what we call the testing, how we individualize the result. So let's say you have a range of probabilities of whether the patient has a disease or not. So let's say you have a patient that you are diagnosing with COVID-19. Let's say your patient lives in a household that have a family that has a family member who already turned out to be COVID-19. They are in close contact. They live in the same house, and then the patient develops the classic symptoms of COVID-19, cough, difficulty of breathing, shortness of breath, desaturation. So the likelihood of the patient having COVID-19 is actually very high. You can peg it at around, let's say, 95%. Usually, if it's 95, let's say you peg your therapeutic threshold at about 90 and your patient is 95, you think, no, based on your clinical acumen, that the likelihood of the patient having COVID-19 is 95, you can actually forego testing the COVID-19. But of course, it's our protocol to still test for RT-PCR. But you can actually stop testing and go straight to therapy. Another example would be common in the clinic will be UTI. So for example, your patient is a female with dysuria, fever, hypogastric pain, no? Do you need to test with urinalysis just to diagnose UTI when in fact the symptoms is very classic, the risk of a female having UTI is high, so most likely you are already in the therapeutic threshold. You can forgo doing the urinalysis and go straight to giving antibiotics to your patient with classic symptoms of UTI already. Okay? So that's actually what I do in the clinic. I don't need urinalysis just to help me diagnose UTI. Sometimes there are conditions, no? For example, in COVID, no, the patient has zero exposure to COVID-19, lives in the house alone, no, doesn't go out, only orders grocery, no symptoms at all. Do you think you need to test for COVID-19? Probably not, because the likelihood of the patient having COVID-19 is very low. No, you don't go beyond the diagnostic threshold. You can just stop testing. You don't need to test. Just reassure the patient. No? So, but there are certain instances where you are not sure whether the patient is really doesn't have COVID-19 or the patient has not 195% sure of having COVID-19, that patient falls between the testing range. The clinician is uncertain, so there is a need to test. No? Probably the patient is a healthcare worker with only very mild symptoms of just a little bit of PC fatigability, no? Not very classic for COVID-19. So you're not sure. She has the risk, she has very, very mild symptoms. You're not sure whether this patient is COVID-19 or not. So this patient falls within the testing range because as a clinician, you are uncertain whether this patient really has COVID-19 or not. So therefore, you need to test the patient. No? So you come up with a clinic. After testing, you should be able to come up with a clinical decision whether to treat the patient right away, no, to carry out more tests, no, or to just reassure the patient. The test is only useful if it moves us out of the testing range, meaning after the test, no, the probability of you having the patient having the disease is already certain, then you go straight to therapy. But if after doing the test, you're now sure that the patient has no COVID-19 or is negative for the disease, no, then you probably need to not start therapy just to reassure. No, it's useful if it moves us out of the testing range. But if you are still within the testing range and you need more tests, no, it's not a very useful test. So how do we individualize the results? So estimate your patient's pretest probability. So for example, in a clinical scenario, an employee, no, with no exposure to COVID-19, we probably can peg it about 9%. 9% is the proportion of asymptomatic people with no COVID, asymptomatic people with COVID-19. No, before early on in the pandemic, that's the figure that we have. So we can peg it as your pretest probability. Sometimes you can get it from the disease prevalence, or sometimes you can estimate it on your own as a clinician. No? So, and then you convert your pretest probability to pretest odds. How do we do that? So remember, your probability is piece of the pie over the whole pie. So that's 9 out of 100. So that's 9%. If we convert it to odds, the piece of the pie minus the rest of the pie. So 100 minus 9. So 9 over 91 is equal to 0.1. That's your pretest odds. And then we multiply your pretest odds by the likelihood ratio. So 0.1 versus 1.43. Let's say this is the likelihood ratio already. Although our computed likelihood ratio is 1.27 if I can remember, no? And then, so that's 0.143, and then you convert the post-test odds to post-test probability, back to probability. So how do we do this? So 0.143 divided by 1 plus 0.143 times 100. So your post-test probability is 12.5%. So do you think the test is useful from a pretest probability of 9% in an asymptomatic person? It only increased the post-test probability to 12.5%. So do you think it's very useful? Probably not, no? Because it only changed the pretest probability by just a few points, no? So not very useful. So now that you have computed your patient's post-test probability of the disease, what's next? Either you stop testing and get on with the treatment of the probable disease, or you stop testing and reassure the patient that the disease probability is low, you don't have any disease, you're healthy, or do more tests before you finally decide whether to treat or not to treat. Okay, so things to consider when contemplating whenever you request a test, because when you become doctors, you will be requesting tests left and right among your patients. Always think, no? Will the test lead to important changes, no, in your treatment, especially if the test is very expensive? You have to think twice. No? If I do a CT scan, will it change my management? No? Will it significantly change the prognosis of my patient? No? Okay, next, if effective treatment is unavailable. So, for example, you want to do genetic testing from some rare disease, but the treatment for that rare disease is not really available in your locality, or it has not been invented yet. No? So why test for that genetic disease? Or probably if you want to know if you're going to be able to pass on to your progeny. But think about it, if the effective treatment is not available, why test for it? You'll not be able to treat. You just know. No? So sometimes some patients, before I do a biopsy, especially in patients who have or are also, I treat a lot of thyroid cancer patients or patients with a thyroid mass. If the patient is very, very old, let's say 85 years old, 90 years old with a mass, before I do a biopsy, I ask them, are you still willing to have the patient operated on? If the patient is not willing to have to undergo surgery anymore, then I don't do the biopsy anymore. Because whether it's positive or not, you will not do an operation anyway. So why do the biopsy? Okay? Next is the cost. Of course, cost is very important because if the test is very expensive, it doesn't really have a big impact on changing your pre-test probability to its post-test probability. Why do the tests? Safety, especially if invasive, especially those involving biopsies, no? You have to think about that. And lastly, informed choice. You have to discuss with your patient. What if this test is positive or not? What's your next step? Are you willing to know what your diagnosis is? Some patients, let's say mammography, if the mammogram turns out positive, how will it affect the patient? Does the patient want to know if she has cancer or not? Or BRCA gene testing, the BRCA gene testing, do you really need to test? If the 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 BRCA gene is positive, what actions will you do after? Can you live with the fact that you have a high risk for cancer? Will it lead to depression? Will it lead to unnecessary testing, etc.? So you have to discuss all of the steps down the line after before doing a test, especially if it's a very, very important test that you have to do. Okay? So in order to shorten the computation, there's what we call a Fagan nomogram. So what you do is, let's do a drawing. 10. So let's say your pretest probability is 10%. Okay? And then your likelihood ratio is, let's say, 50 or 10, 20%. So what we do is I'll try to draw a straight line. A straight line. And then this will be now your post-test probability. So this will help you decide whether to treat or not to treat, etc. You see there's a big change from 10% to 75%. If the post-test if the likelihood ratio is, let's say, 0.05, 10%, how does it change your post-test probability? It markedly decreases your post-test probability. Okay, so you can probably just stop, almost certain that the patient doesn't have a disease and you don't need to treat, and you can stop testing already. So my reference is Painless EBM. So I hope I was able to teach you how to appraise an article for diagnosis. Okay, thank you very much and have a good day.